And with that, everything changed. I was no longer just Gabriella, the girl who lived in the background. I was Gabriella, the woman who had built something from nothing. I had created a life on my own terms, one where I didn't need anyone's approval to feel complete. As my business flourished and new opportunities came my way, I no longer sought validation. I no longer cared about their opinions or their expectations. I had built my own path, and I walked it proudly, knowing that I didn't need anyone's permission to be who I was. One day, while reviewing a collection of vintage gems in my new office, I found an old, faded swan-shaped hairpin, one of the first antiques I had ever fallen in love with at Grandma's house. The same lavender stones that had once captivated me as a child now glistened in the soft light of my office. It wasn't the most valuable piece in my collection, but it was the most precious to me. It marked the beginning of everything, the first step in my journey toward understanding my worth. I wrapped it in a blue velvet box and placed it on the shelf in my private gallery, where it would remain as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the rarest gems are not the ones buried in dust, but the ones that are hidden beneath the weight of years of being overlooked. And that the greatest treasure is not what others see in you, but what you see in yourself. I had finally found my own light, and no one could take that from me. I hired 2 more appraisal specialists and expanded my business even further. We began handling multi-million-dollar auctions, working with high-profile collectors and estates. I signed partnerships with major auction houses and signed contracts that solidified my company's position in the market. But still, even as the business grew, I remained grounded in my values. I wasn't doing this for the recognition anymore. I was doing it because it was mine. I eventually moved into a new home, a modest mid-century style villa in the outskirts of Madison, overlooking Lake Minad. It wasn't flashy, but it was quiet, private, and exactly what I needed. The house was my sanctuary, a place where I could finally live life on my own terms. I designed the space to reflect who I was, who I had become. It was a place where I could finally be myself, without the constant pressure to shrink, to be less than what I was. Grandma came to stay with me for a few weeks that summer. She was the one person who had always believed in me, who had never expected me to be anything other than exactly who I was. One evening, as we sat on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset over the lake, she said something that stayed with me. "You know, Gabriella," she said, her voice soft but steady, "family isn't the people who pull you back when you're trying to fly. You've lived in their shadow long enough. It's time you choose your own light." Those words struck me like a bolt of lightning. I had spent so much of my life living in the shadow of my family's expectations, trying to be enough for them, trying to make them see me. But now, I was free. I had chosen my own light, and for the first time in my life, I could finally breathe without the weight of their judgments bearing down on me. The silence that followed was deafening. My phone buzzed with messages, but I ignored them all. The first few were from Mom, desperate and pleading. "Gabriella, you're making everything worse," she wrote. "We need to talk. Lily's falling apart. You can't just walk away like this." Then came the messages from Lily herself, accusing me of ruining everything, of betraying her, of not being there when she needed me most. But I didn't respond. I couldn't. The weight of their expectations, the years of unspoken demands, had finally broken something inside me. I knew that they would never change, never see me for who I truly was. And I was done trying to make them. It wasn't about cutting them off forever, though it felt like that in the moment. It was about finding peace in the silence, about understanding that sometimes you have to choose yourself, even if it means letting go of the people who were supposed to be your foundation. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was allowed to exist without apology. I went back to my apartment, alone but not lonely. I took a deep breath and let the weight of everything I had walked away from settle into my bones. I had worked so hard for this freedom, for the life I had built on my own. I didn't need their validation anymore. I didn't need their approval. I was already enough. The following week, things started to change at work. The news of my confrontation with my family spread like wildfire. Some clients reached out, not to ask about what had happened, but because they admired the fact that I had finally stood up for myself. They saw my decision not as a weakness, but as a powerful declaration of independence. They trusted me more than ever. And I began to receive more inquiries, more contracts, and more opportunities. People respected the fact that I had stayed silent for so long, but when the time came, I had finally spoken up. A few months later, I got a call from a major European museum inviting me to collaborate on a project to restore a lost 18th century jewelry set. It was an opportunity that would solidify my place in the industry, an honor that few people in my field ever received. The project was everything I had worked for, everything I had dreamed of. And yet, I felt strangely indifferent to it all. I wasn't driven by the need to prove myself anymore. I was driven by the love I had found for this work, this world of forgotten gems and hidden treasures. We specialize in antique jewelry and estate asset authentication. This is my work. This is my life. For a moment, the room remained still, frozen in disbelief. But then the questions started. The accusations, the demands for an explanation. Lily was the loudest, her voice cracking with a mix of frustration and jealousy. "You have that kind of money and didn't tell me? Didn't tell any of us?" she shouted. "Why didn't you trust me?" I didn't even know how to answer her. My sister, who had always been the center of attention, who had never had to work for anything, was suddenly accusing me of betrayal. The irony was almost too much to bear. "Family is supposed to share," she continued, her voice shaking. "You should have told me, Gabriella. You should have shared this with us." I could feel the anger rising inside me. The years of being ignored, the years of watching them build everything around Lily while I was left to fend for myself. They had never seen me. Never truly seen me. "Family doesn't mean carrying the people who always look down on you," I said quietly. "I've been the one who's been there. The one who's always helped, always supported, always quietly given. But not anymore." I turned to my mother, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I had kept inside for so long. "Do you remember when I got into the gifted program? Or when I got a perfect score on the SAT? Do you remember my graduation?" Her eyes shifted uncomfortably, but she said nothing. "None of you ever showed up. All of it was forgotten because Lily needed more. Lily was always the one who mattered. But I'm done." I didn't wait for them to respond. I didn't need to. The truth was out now. I had made my choice. And as I left the room, I felt something I had never felt before. Relief. Finally, I was choosing myself. I left without looking back. I had no desire to explain, no need to justify my actions. What mattered now was my future, the life I was building for myself. I was done trying to prove my worth to people who would never understand. And in that moment, I knew I was free. The decision to walk away from my family wasn't something I had planned. It wasn't a moment of calculated rebellion. It was a quiet act of self-preservation. For years, I had tried to be seen, to be noticed, to be acknowledged by people who would never truly see me. But when I left that Thanksgiving dinner, closing the door behind me, I realized something profound. I didn't need their approval anymore. When the day arrived, I felt strangely detached from it all. There was no pride in what I had done, no satisfaction in their faces when they saw the spread. It was just another task for them, another thing I had to do for them. But as I stood there, watching them all fuss over the food, a quiet realization settled in my chest. I wasn't doing this for them anymore. I wasn't even doing it for me. I was doing it because I felt like I had to. Dinner started, and everyone was in awe of the food. The table looked like something out of a magazine, with every dish plated to perfection. But even as I served wine and quietly moved around the room, I felt the familiar tension rise in my chest. Lily was there, of course, with her new boyfriend. She was smiling, laughing, surrounded by everyone's attention. She wore a designer bag, the same one she had shown off on Instagram just a few weeks earlier. And then, as the evening wore on, Lily's voice pierced the air. "Gabriella," she called, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. "Do you mind if I borrow your laptop? I want to show everyone just how cool your little antique job is." I froze. The moment she picked up the laptop, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. She spun the screen around, showing the whole room the dashboard of my company's account. Balances, contracts, earnings. My eyes locked on the numbers displayed there. $12,600,000 in cash, $400,000 in pending contracts, and the latest quarterly report showing earnings of over $4 million. The room fell silent. I could hear the scrape of a fork against a plate, the soft clink of glass, and then nothing. No one said a word. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather myself, trying to make sense of what was happening. I knew what was coming. I could already feel it, the anger, the surprise, the judgment in their eyes. They had no idea who I had become, and suddenly I didn't care. Mom was the first to speak. "Gabriella, what is all this?" she asked, her voice low but sharp, the disbelief cutting through the silence. I looked around at my family. No one seemed to know how to react. No one knew how to process the fact that I wasn't just Gabriella, the quiet one, anymore. I was Gabriella, the one who had built a life they could never understand. "I'm the CEO of Orem and Iris," I said softly, but firmly. "I've been building this company for years, 3 offices, a team." It wasn't until much later that I truly started to feel the weight of the success I had been quietly building. By the time I had secured a few important contracts and built a steady clientele, my life had changed in ways I hadn't even fully realized. The more I achieved, the more I felt like I was living in 2 separate worlds. The one where I was building a future on my own terms, and the one where I was still the overlooked child, a shadow in my own family. I hadn't shared much with them, not out of secrecy, but because I had stopped needing their validation. Still, the nagging feeling of wanting them to acknowledge my efforts was always there, quietly gnawing at the edges of my mind. It was hard to ignore the fact that I was becoming more successful by the day, while my family remained stuck in their narrow world. They were still so consumed by Lily's needs, her ever-changing dreams, that they barely saw me anymore. One holiday season, my family gathered for Thanksgiving, as they always did. I had promised myself I wouldn't go. I was tired of being the invisible one. I had enough of the constant comparisons, of being treated like I didn't exist beyond the chores and financial help I quietly provided. But that year something shifted. Mom called me, her voice more fragile than I had heard in years. "Gabriella," she said, her words heavy with exhaustion, "I haven't been feeling well. We're not really up for cooking this year. Everyone's expecting the holiday dinner, and you know how it is. Could you just take care of it this time?" I hesitated, but then I heard the quiet pleading in her voice. The family would notice if I didn't show up. They would notice if I didn't make the dinner they expected. I agreed, though a part of me wanted to escape entirely, to leave it all behind and never look back. But I didn't. I took control, just like I had always done in my life, despite the overwhelming urge to be invisible. I contacted a high-end catering service in Chicago, one that specialized in private dinners for collectors and high-end events. They came to the house with silver trays, portable ovens, and a professional tablescape designer. It wasn't just a meal, it was a work of art, a feast that would wow even the most discerning guests. Stories hidden in every piece of jewelry, the craftsmanship that transcended generations, and the delicate beauty of forgotten objects that spoke to me in a way nothing else ever had. While my classmates eagerly rushed into internships with big-name firms, I took a different path. I found an unpaid internship at a small jewelry appraisal firm in Chicago. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't lucrative, but I didn't care. This was my chance to learn from the ground up, to build a foundation for a future that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. At first, I spent my days sorting through boxes of jewelry, learning to identify different cuts, stones, and styles. There were hours spent hunched over magnifying glasses, peering at diamonds and rubies, studying their flaws and imperfections. There were days when I was given pieces that no one cared about, necklaces that looked too old, rings that seemed too plain. But I didn't mind. I saw the value in every one of them. My supervisors didn't pay much attention to me at first. I was just the intern, the girl who fetched coffee and filed papers. But slowly, over time, they started to notice something. I had an eye for detail, an intuition for what was real and what was fake. I could see the history in a piece, feel the craftsmanship in my hands. It wasn't just about knowing the value. It was about understanding the story behind the gem, the person who had once worn it, and the era it had come from. One day, I was handed a brooch, a simple piece. Nothing remarkable about it, at first glance. It was labeled as costume jewelry, maybe worth a few $dozen at most. But something in me told me there was more to it. The design was subtle, but exquisite. The enamel was flawless, the edges finely engraved. There was a tiny mark on the back, worn and faded from years of use. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a cheap piece. I spent the entire evening researching that mark. It took hours, digging through archives, looking through books on French artisans, and even contacting a friend from the university library to help me access museum records. Finally, I found it. The mark belonged to a French artisan who had once created jewelry for the nobility in the early 20th century, before his workshop was destroyed during the war. The brooch wasn't just authentic, it was rare, and worth far more than anyone had thought. I was stunned. The words barely registered. "Don't tell Lily?" I repeated, almost under my breath, the excitement draining from my chest. "Why?" Mom didn't answer, only continued cutting, her focus elsewhere. Lily's stress, Lily's needs. Once again, it was all about her. My heart sank. In that moment, I understood. No matter what I achieved, it would always be secondary to Lily's needs, to Lily's struggles. Even my own success could not stand in the spotlight. I nodded slowly, trying to hide the hurt that threatened to pour out. "Okay," I said, quietly. And just like that, I put the acceptance letter away. Another triumph swallowed whole by the silence of my family's indifference. It wasn't that I expected them to drop everything and throw a party for me. I wasn't a child anymore, and I knew better than to expect things like that. But a simple acknowledgement, a "we're proud of you," would have meant the world to me. Instead, I was left with nothing but the hollow echo of Lily's name, repeated over and over in their conversations. I had done everything right. I had fought tooth and nail to get here, to be the person they could never see. But in their eyes, I was just another quiet child who had found her place in the background. Just another success they could brush off because Lily's struggles were more important. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't going to wait for them to see me anymore. I was done. I didn't expect anything from them anymore, and that was the hardest realization of all. I wasn't just invisible in their eyes, I was something they had never even bothered to understand. But that night, as I sat alone in my room, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't gonna let their blindness define me. I had my future ahead of me, and I would make sure that no one could take that from me. Not even them. So, I left for Northwestern with nothing but my ambition and my determination to make it on my own. I didn't need them to approve. I didn't need them to be proud. I was going to prove to myself and to the world that I was enough. The first few months at Northwestern were a whirlwind. I threw myself into my studies, immersing myself in the world of art history and antique jewelry. It was a field I had always been passionate about, even before I understood why. There was something about I applied to 12 colleges, each one a step toward a future I knew I deserved, but could never expect from my family. Northwestern University was my first choice, partly because it had an amazing art history program, and partly because I wanted to prove to myself that I could get in, that I was capable of success without their help. I wrote essays in the small bakery during my breaks, hiding my ambition behind the counter as I cleaned trays and served coffee. Mrs. Lorraine, who had become my mentor in those years, even helped me with my essays. She never asked why I wanted to go to college or why I worked at a bakery. She just believed in me. "Gabriella," she said one day, her voice warm with understanding, "you've got a fire in you. Just keep fanning it. No one can take that from you." Her words stuck with me as I wrote those essays. It wasn't just about grades or achievements anymore. It was about telling my story, a story no one had ever asked me to tell. Then came the day. The letter. I still remember holding it in my hands, my fingers trembling as I opened it. "Congratulations," it began, and I felt my heart leap. "You've been accepted to Northwestern University. A full-ride scholarship. It was everything I had worked for, everything I had fought for, every long night spent alone, every sacrifice made to get to this moment." I was thrilled, but at the same time, I felt the weight of the years of invisibility. I wasn't just walking into a new chapter of my life, I was walking away from everything I had known, leaving behind a family that had never truly seen me. I brought the letter home, my hands shaking with excitement. Mom was in the kitchen, her back turned as she sliced vegetables. I felt the butterflies in my stomach, the thrill of finally showing them my success. But when I placed the letter in front of her, the excitement in me faltered. "Look, Mom," I said, trying to keep the joy in my voice. "I got into Northwestern, full scholarship." She glanced at the letter briefly, then turned back to the vegetables, her knife making soft chopping sounds on the cutting board. "Oh, that's nice," she said, her voice flat. "But don't tell Lily, she's been stressed out lately." Lily's needs that they never noticed the little victories I had. I knew I couldn't keep living for their approval. "I don't need them to see me," I whispered to myself. "I can make my own way." But even as the words left my mouth, the truth settled in. I had been waiting my whole life for them to see me, for them to acknowledge me the way I had always craved. But they never would. Lily would always be the one who needed more, and I would always be the one who could handle it alone. And that realization, though painful, gave me something more valuable than their recognition. It gave me freedom. Freedom from the idea that my worth was tied to their attention. Freedom from the need to be acknowledged by people who had never truly seen me. The next day at school, I was asked to draw a picture for a class project. It wasn't anything extraordinary, but for the first time, I wasn't seeking approval for it. I simply created because I wanted to, because it was what I loved. It didn't matter if anyone cared about the picture, it was mine. For the first time in a long while, I didn't need anyone's validation to feel complete. The shift was gradual, but it was there. Every day as I worked at the bakery and kept to myself at home, I began to form a new identity. One that was separate from my family, one that was shaped by my own choices and my own quiet victories. I wasn't just Gabriella, the girl who lived in Lily's shadow anymore. I was Gabriella, the girl who had a future all her own. In those small, everyday moments, I started to see my own potential. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was enough. I had known it all along. I just had to remember. By the time I entered high school, I was more determined than ever to escape the suffocating walls of my family's expectations. They had never seen me for who I was, only for what I could provide in the background, a quiet support to Lily's louder, more demanding needs. It wasn't that I hated my sister. Lily was just a child, after all. But the way my family treated me, the way they treated her like a precious gem and me like a shadow, was something I could no longer tolerate. So, I started planning. I was done waiting for their approval. I had already learned to be invisible to them, to disappear in the crowd. But now, I wanted to be seen in a way that they couldn't ignore. I had always been smart, more than capable of achieving great things if only I had the chance. It was time to take that chance on my own terms. By the time I was in 8th grade, something inside me had shifted. I no longer wanted to be the girl who quietly waited for attention that never came. I didn't want to be a shadow anymore. It wasn't that I suddenly wanted to be the center of everyone's world. I had learned long ago that wasn't going to happen. But I wanted to feel like I could stand on my own, like I could be something more than just the invisible one in the background. So, I decided to take action. I applied for a job at the local bakery, Sugar Pines. It wasn't much, just a part-time job sweeping floors, taking orders, and washing trays. But it was mine. I didn't need anyone's approval, and I didn't care if they didn't understand why I was working at 13 years old. The only thing I knew for sure was that I wanted to prove to myself that I could take care of something outside of this house, outside of Lily's shadow. When Mrs. Lorraine, the owner of the bakery, hired me, she didn't ask why a 13-year-old was so eager to mop floors or work a cash register. She just smiled, gave me a little nod, and said, "If you work hard, you deserve a place in the world." Those words felt like a lifeline, like someone had finally thrown me a rope when I didn't even know I was drowning. I couldn't explain it, but the moment she said that, something clicked in me. I had been invisible for so long, but maybe, just maybe, I was worth more than the way my family had treated me. Maybe I didn't need them to tell me I was important. Maybe I could find it for myself. I spent every day after school at Sugar Pines, working alongside Mrs. Lorraine. The bakery became my second home. There, I didn't have to worry about making too much noise or being too visible. I could just work, quietly and steadily, and know that my efforts were valued. It was simple, but it was mine. At home, nothing changed. I still felt the same cold distance between me and my family. But at the bakery, I was seen for who I was, not for the person I was supposed to be. There was no pressure to be perfect, no need to step aside to make way for Lily. There was only the satisfaction of a job well done. One night, after a particularly long shift, I sat on the floor of my room, my back against the wall, exhausted but strangely content. I had a few coins in my pocket from tips that day, small insignificant amounts, but it felt like more than I had ever had before. I thought about the family I left behind downstairs, the ones who were so consumed by, and I didn't know how to fix it, because what could I do when the whole orchestra only played for Lily? I remember the day I came home, clutching the certificate for winning first place in the school science fair. It was the first time I felt like I had truly done something great, something that deserved recognition. My heart raced as I rushed to the kitchen, hoping to see Mom's smile, to hear her voice light up with pride. But when I entered, she was standing by the stove, stirring something in a pot. "Mom, look," I said, holding the certificate high. "I won first place in the science fair." She glanced at it briefly, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. But then, without even a pause, she turned back to the stove and muttered, "Lily needs more water." Her voice was flat, the words dull and lifeless, like the air had been sucked out of the room. And just like that, it hit me. No matter what I achieved, no matter how many awards I brought home, they would always be overshadowed by Lily's needs. And Lily's needs were always the priority. Always. The thing is, I didn't need constant praise, and I didn't need to be the center of attention. But there was a part of me, just a tiny part, that needed to feel like I mattered. That I was worthy of a smile, a good job, or a genuine hug. Something more than the fleeting recognition I got for keeping the house quiet or staying out of the way. But even then, I learned to keep quiet. To fade into the walls, where I could make myself as small and unnoticed as possible. The room became my refuge. It wasn't just the smell of peppermint oil and the faint scent of old books that made it mine. It was the only space where I could breathe without the suffocating weight of being invisible. It was the place where I found solace in art history, in learning about the stories behind antique pieces that had long been forgotten by time. It became the only place where I didn't have to be someone I wasn't. Where I could be Gabriella, the girl who loved history, the girl who had dreams beyond the walls of the house. But despite all this, my longing for acknowledgement didn't disappear. Every time I accomplished something, every time I did something worthy of praise, I couldn't help but feel the sting of knowing it would go unnoticed. "Gabriella, don't you think you should be more focused on, helping out around here?" Mom would say one evening as I showed her a drawing I had spent hours perfecting. I started to avoid them altogether, retreating into my room. It wasn't a choice at first. It just happened. The silence between us grew thicker, more suffocating. The walls of my room became the only place I could breathe freely. Inside those walls, I could pretend like I didn't care. I could pretend like it didn't hurt that I was slowly being erased. It was strange, because at Grandma's house I was still me. Grandma, unlike anyone else, saw me for who I was. When I was there, she'd listen to my stories, praise me for the things I loved, and let me sort through her collection of antiques like we were partners in an unsolved mystery. It was only when I came back to my own house that the loneliness set in again. At home, I was just the other child, the one who could handle things on her own, the one who didn't need attention or praise. "Mom, I don't need a trophy. I just need a moment," I'd whisper to myself. But it never seemed to reach her. Every word I spoke was absorbed by the constant hum of Lily's monitors. Every glance I gave was met with a distracted sigh. There were days when I couldn't help but wonder, if I wasn't here, would they even notice? Would they even care? One afternoon I sat in my room, flipping through a book about art history, trying to escape. But I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about the things I used to do, the person I used to be before Lily arrived. The girl who laughed loudly at the dinner table, who wanted to show her mom the latest science project, who shared her wins with the family. I had to admit, I missed her. I missed the girl who mattered. Why is she so special? The thought crept into my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake off. Why was Lily always the one who needed everything, and why did I always have to wait for my turn? The house was a silent battleground now, where every step I took felt like walking through fog. The more I tried to show my worth, the more I realized no one was looking. They were all too busy watching Lily's every breath, too focused on her survival to notice mine. But what if I stopped waiting? What if I stopped trying to make them see me? For the first time, I wondered if maybe I didn't need them to. The days grew longer, but my efforts to be seen felt more futile than ever. I started to understand that no matter how hard I tried, no matter what I did, I would always be the background noise in the family's symphony. The days blurred together, each one stretching endlessly into the next. The once vibrant, noisy home had become eerily silent, suffocated by the constant hum of air purifiers and the soft click of hand sanitizer bottles. Every time I opened the door, the smell of bleach hit me, like an invisible wall that kept me at arm's length from the life I once knew. "Gabriella, do you mind staying in your room for a while?" Mom would ask, in a voice that didn't sound quite like hers. It wasn't unkind, but it was distant, as though she was speaking to someone she didn't know well. "Lily's napping. It's important to keep everything calm for her." Each time those words came out of her mouth, they felt like a brick slowly sinking in my chest. At first I thought I was just imagining it, the way they seemed to subtly push me away, but after a while it became too clear to ignore. The house wasn't mine anymore. It was Lily's, and everything revolved around her. Every decision, every conversation was about her health, her well-being, her needs. I was just a bystander in my own life. Even when I tried to show Mom something I had done, like the perfect score on my math test, it felt like the paper was a weight I was holding for no reason. The praise, the approval I so desperately wanted, never came. "That's good, Gabriella," Mom would say, but her eyes were always fixed on Lily, who, at that moment, was wrapped in a blanket, resting under a warm light. "I think Lily needs more water. Can you make sure she gets it?" I could feel it in my bones. I didn't matter. Not to them. Not in the way Lily did. Every attempt to gain their attention, whether it was winning first place in the science fair, drawing pictures, or bringing home awards, was met with the same cold indifference. "Lily's fever is going up. Gabriella, please be quiet," Mom would say, brushing past me, her attention entirely consumed by the small, fragile body lying in the crib. What hurt more than anything wasn't the indifference, it was that I was slowly becoming invisible. It wasn't just my achievements that were unnoticed, it was my very existence. The girl who once held the spotlight in her family had become the girl who quietly stayed in the shadows, afraid to make a sound, too scared to make a ripple. A constant reminder of the life hanging in the balance. As the days passed, Lily stayed in the hospital. When she finally came home, our entire house was transformed. Sanitizer everywhere, air purifiers running at full blast. The smell of bleach was so strong it burned my throat at night, making sleep feel like a distant memory. There were rules I had to follow now, rules that made it feel like I wasn't welcome anymore. If I coughed or sneezed, I was sent away to Grandma's house. At first it felt like a treat. Grandma always made apple pie and had new books waiting for me. But as the weeks wore on, the truth started to settle in. I wasn't allowed to be in my own home. I was seen as a threat to Lily, as if my presence, my very being, could jeopardize her health. One afternoon, I brought home a perfect math test score, something I thought Mom would be proud of. She glanced at it briefly before turning her attention back to Lily, who had a slight fever. "Lily's not feeling well," she said. "Can you take this to Dad?" That was it. No praise, no excitement. Just the dull feeling of being dismissed, like I didn't matter anymore. Why did it hurt so much when I did everything right, yet nothing seemed to change? Why couldn't I be seen? The house became quieter as Lily's needs grew. It wasn't that anyone hated me or didn't care. It was just that everything revolved around her now. I started to feel like I was disappearing in my own family, slowly fading into the background while Lily took up every ounce of attention. "Gabriella, can you go to your room for a while?" Mom would ask, her voice tired, not unkind but distant. Lily's resting and it's best if we keep it quiet. I would nod and retreat to my room. It became my sanctuary, even though it was more of a cage than anything else. The scent of peppermint oil hung in the air, a smell I had grown to love, but it became another barrier between me and the rest of the world. Lily couldn't come in, it was too strong for her. And so, I was left alone, with my thoughts and my art. But the silence weighed on me, heavy and unrelenting. Did they even realize I was there anymore? Or was I just a shadow in the corner of a house that no longer felt like home? And with that silence, the questions began to build. Why was it always Lily? Why was I never enough? The cracks in the family began to widen, and the distance between us felt harder to ignore. What if I wasn't supposed to be invisible anymore? I've spent years hiding in plain sight, pretending to be invisible. But guess what? I'm done with that now. I'm Gabriella, and I've spent most of my life being the quiet one, the background character in my own story. No one saw me, not really, except for the ones who thought they could use me. But things are different now. You'll want to keep reading, because you might just be surprised by how this story ends. Or how it begins. It was one of those quiet nights that stretched on, peaceful but full of unspoken words. I remember the night Mom was taken to the hospital. The knock on the door, urgent and rapid, jolted me from a sound sleep. I stumbled out of bed, my heart thudding in my chest, unsure of what was happening. Aunt Evelyn's face was pale as she stood in the doorway, her hand clutching the handle like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Gabriella, we need to go," she said, her voice tremulous, as though she could barely get the words out. "Your mom, she's at the hospital. Your sister is coming early, 2 months too soon. We need to hurry." A tiny spark of confusion flickered inside me. My baby sister? How could she be here already? I couldn't wrap my mind around it, but there was no time to ask. I grabbed my coat, still half asleep, trying to make sense of it all. The air felt cold as we rushed out to the car. Headlights cutting through the dark like a pair of glaring eyes, never quite letting me see what was ahead. What was happening? Why now? The hospital was a blur of bright lights and sterile smells. I didn't understand most of what was happening, but the one thing that became clear to me in that moment was that nothing would ever be the same again. Lily was here, tiny, fragile, so small she barely looked real. She was hooked up to machines, surrounded by tubes, her small body encased in an incubator. I couldn't even get close to her. "Stay back, Gabriella," Mom said, her voice distant. "We can't risk her getting sick." I stood there a few feet away, watching my little sister through the glass. I wanted to reach out, to hold her hand, but when I stepped closer, Mom's eyes shot up, her gaze cold and firm. "Don't, not yet." I froze, my heart aching with something I couldn't quite name. Why wasn't I allowed near her? Wasn't she my sister too? But I kept quiet, the weight of those unspoken words pressing down on me. The sound of the heart monitors beeping became the loudest thing in the room,